Number 15 is The Windup Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi. I really enjoyed this. This is a dystopian setting in future Thailand. Calories are king. The seed companies pretty much dominate everything because all of our crops by this point have succumbed to, I want to say the diseases are called blister rust and cibiscosis, something along those lines. We have all of these Western seed companies pretty much dominating everything, and there is this seed bank in Thailand that is very coveted. There are political shenanigans going on around that. There is not a lot of electricity-based technology in this future world, but because we're out of oil and natural resources of the like, so we're relying on things like kink springs, which you can read the book to find out what those are, dirigibles, which are basically hot air balloons that they use to transport goods and things like that. This is best put in the biopunk category. It's a really interesting read. We follow at least 4 different points of view, and some of those points of view shift throughout the book. And then the titular wind-up girl is this character Emiko, who is basically a modified human. These wind-ups are illegal, so Emiko finds herself in Thailand, but because she is illegal, she is forced to work in these brothels and she's treated awfully. So it's a really dark read in a lot of ways, and there's not a whole lot of hope, but it is a really interesting view of a dystopian world. Bacigalupi really creates a really vivid picture of what he wants you to see in this future Thailand, and it's a very gripping story. I liked it a lot. As it turns out, I made number 15 a tie. I have 2 books at number 15, so you're gonna get 16 books from me today. Also at number 15 in this tie is The Membranes by Chi Ta Wei. This is translated fiction. Chi Ta Wei is a Taiwanese author, so this was originally written in Chinese, and I read, of course, the translation because I don't speak Chinese. This is another dystopian novel. I do love my dystopian reads. This one is definitely a different setting, although there is a lot of water at play in the first book, Wind-Up Girl. This, we are now underneath the water, because in the membranes, things are so bad on the surface, everybody's moved underwater. So everybody's living underwater in domes, and your population and your power, all of that, the equivalent of that dictates how much domage or space you get under the water. But have no fear, because it could be dangerous to have wars among these nations underwater. They still do their warring and all that stuff up on the land. Nothing else happens up there. Maybe there's some prisons and a few other things, maybe some tourist stuff, but pretty much it's war up there when there needs to be war. Everything else takes place underwater. The main character is Momo. She is a dermal care technician, and she works on people's skin, but it's not all of what it seems to be. So you definitely have this feeling when you're reading this book. It's a short read, and you know not quite everything is adding up, and it's definitely a weird environment. You're trying to wonder, like, what's the reveal going to be at the end here? And that's really exciting. The focus on the skin, which is a membrane, is a big part of the story. The work that Momo does with people's skin is also not all that it's cracked up to be, so there's some secret there. There are really heavy AI themes in this that are very interesting, and there are some really interesting gender themes in this as well. I highly recommend this one. Number 14 is Ancillary Justice by Ann Leckie. This was a really interesting novel. This is the first book of the Imperial Reich trilogy, and the whole trilogy is very good, and I highly recommend the whole trilogy. What's interesting here is we have Breck, who was at one point a sentient spaceship, was the AI or the intelligence and the consciousness of this spaceship. The spaceship has long since been destroyed, so we find Breck, who is sort of wandering on a mission, and it's a revenge mission. So that's already interesting. There's an interesting partnership that happens along the way that gives us sort of Left Hand of Darkness, Ursula Le Guin vibes. That's very cool. Again, there's some interesting gender stuff in this, because everyone is referred to at almost all points using female gender pronouns, like she and her. And it's really, it's very interesting because the characters are different, presumably different genders, but we don't know because Breck only in her language uses her and she and is not familiar with the other pronouns. So that makes it very interesting. Again, like Left Hand of Darkness, there's a ice planet involved in this, which is sort of an interesting backdrop, and some really great world building around that. But the real exciting part about this is that there is a revenge element to it, and the powers that be, or power that powers that be are in this vein of like unopposable, unstoppable. So how do you overcome that? You really get caught up in Breck's voyage, her journey, and the revenge that she's seeking. At number 13 is a real classic. This is Clifford Simak's City. This is the history of a man told by dogs. This is a fix-up novel, so a lot of short stories that were sort of plugged together. It works really well. So these are like dog scholars, because in this future dogs are evolved now, and because of a human long ago, they now have this ability to speak and reason and communicate with each other and with other humans. And we see the evolution of these dogs. We see evolutions of humanity as told by these dogs. And the common thread pulling all these stories together is a robot, an AI, who is probably the most interesting character in the book. And that makes this a really great read. That's why it's on this list. I've always loved this book. This was a reread for me. But the idea of a robot character being sort of the common thread and the most interesting character in the book, that does happen a lot in science fiction. And it's something I really love. I'll point you to my reviews of I, Robot and Caves of Steel. Not just those ones, but this is another really great example of that. There is, themes of mutants in this, human evolution, and a really interesting take on the potential end of mankind, or the decision to end mankind, or if mankind ends, what would it look like? Is it necessarily a horrible thing? Check it out for all of those reasons. I should remind or point out, I previously aired an episode of my top new releases of 2022. Today, if it's not already clear, I'm talking about my favorite reads of the year, not just new releases. Approximately half of these are rereads and half are books that I've read for the first time. The order or ranking is based on how much I got out of the reads this year. It's not a ranking of all-time favorite reading experiences. Number 12 is The Freeze Frame Revolution by Peter Watts. This is time dilation science fiction. It's time dilation science fiction at its best. We're on this ship that I believe is inside of a comet or a meteor, and the crew is in cold hibernation for most of the time unless they're called upon by the chimp, which is the AI who basically project manages the ship. What's interesting about the chimp is he's AI, but he's slightly less intelligent than the members of the crew. And there's good reason for that, and it does play a role in the story. So that's really kind of interesting, because usually the AI is going to be much smarter, runs the ship, and everybody's in hibernation, right? So you can see many ways in which this go awry. Some are predictable and some not quite predictable. But what's interesting is the crew questions the chimp. They're in hibernation for thousands of years at some points, and questions a lot of the decisions that the chimp is making, and kind of wonders like, well, what happens if we think we should be doing one thing and the chimp thinks that the mission calls for something else? So this sort of sets up a mutiny, and kind of the big question on this, and this is sort of comes from the cover of the book as well. How do you do a mutiny when you're in hibernation for most of the time? Well, this book answers that question, and it's really, really interesting. The character of the ship itself is interesting. There's a lot of things going on in the ship. It's very secretive. How they leave messages for each other, or how they plan this mutiny, a very enjoyable read. Number 11 is Beta by Adam Roberts. This is Animal Farm on steroids. I didn't love Animal Farm by George Orwell, but I did love Beta by Adam Roberts. They're not comparable other than the fact that you've got sort of, well, I guess they are comparable because you have a lot of things in common. You have talking animals, you've got war and strategy and things like that. You've got tensions between animals and humanity, and you get all of that in Beta. What I really like about this, though, is it sort of explains why these animals are talking. There is a chip that's been invented by eco-activists, or environmentalists, I guess eco-activists. It's bestowed upon animals the ability to speak and perhaps reason and communicate. And the question then, obviously, that arises is, how do we treat animals once they can now communicate and reason with us? And there's a very humorous beginning part of the book. The book isn't a funny book, and it doesn't try too hard at it, but there are some of the funniest moments I've ever read in a science fiction book in this book. One of them is this initial scene where Farmer Graham, who is the main character of the book, is about to, bolt shoot cow and put him out. That's what he does. He's a farmer and sells the meat, and he runs a farm. But now this cow is basically begging for his life. Not begging, but reasoning for his life. So, what can the farmer do? And then you got to contemplate, well, is this going to be the law of the land now? Is you can't kill animals. You can't, we can't eat animals. Also, like what does it mean then in terms of our pets or cats and dogs? Have they been kind of in servitude to us just to give us love and affection and are slaves? That might be pushing it a little bit, right? But it brings up a lot of really interesting questions. One of the really interesting things about this too is it's never clear cut if it's the chip that's really controlling everything and responsible for all the reasoning coming from these animals, and the animal's just sort of a conduit, or is the chip merging with an actual consciousness that was there in the animal, and those are sort of working in tandem. That makes this really interesting food for thought. It makes it a great read. This is a great introduction to Adam Roberts, who is maybe not as well known as some of the authors on this list, and it's an author that I recommend really highly. It's an author that I started reading this year. Number 10 is Eyes of the Void by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is book 2 in Tchaikovsky's Final Architect series, along with book 1, Shards of Earth. We have these moon-sized destroyers of worlds called the Architects. They destroy these worlds, they turn them inside out, and they're described as looking like sculptures of gigantic flowers. Well, as beautiful as that is, what's not beautiful is it means billions of people are dead when this happens. So in both of these first 2 books, it's all about, who are these architects and why are they attacking? You get a lot of that in book 1, Shards of Earth, and you get a lot of that in book 2, Eyes of the Void. And Eyes of the Void starts to answer some of those questions and also gets us to look at who is pulling the strings of these architects. Again, why? Looky here, number 9, another Adam Roberts novel. This is The Thing Itself. So I went all in with Roberts this year, started reading this author at the same time I was reading Beta. I started reading The Thing Itself. So it was really interesting to pick up this author reading 2 of his books at the same time, and both very different. So this is an author that has a lot of range. And again, the one word that I'll put on this book that I would put on the other book is philosophic. This is philosophic science fiction. This even more so, I think, than Beta. The focus here is the Fermi paradox and applying Immanuel Kant to that, if that's even possible. I don't know. Maybe it was because I didn't understand all of this book. This is one of these books where I left not understanding everything that I read. There is a main story, and there are also a lot of kind of offshoot side stories. So I think I got the main story, which was brilliant, and some of the other side stories, which were also really brilliant, especially ones relating to sort of time and space. And then there's 1 or 2 side stories that were just, I think, over my head. I don't think it was the author. I'm pretty sure it was me. It starts out with 2 characters, Charles Gardner and Roy Curtius. I believe that's how you pronounce their names. And they are, on this mission in Antarctica, and it's centered around the Fermi paradox. Fermi paradox being the idea of it's likely that there's alien life out there, but why haven't we met them? Why haven't they contacted us? And I'm sort of being very generic with that description because I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but there is really interesting, I want to say, Neuromancer vibes to this. I had the same sense of when I read Neuromancer, another book that I really love, in the idea that there's sort of an ambiguous AI that is powerful, is kind of pulling strings, knows things that are going on. We don't know if we can trust it. The reader doesn't know if they can trust it. There's a lot of interesting things going on with time and space. Then moving more away from this coming back to the philosophic, where the Kant comes into this is Kant's theories of transcendental idealism, the idea that we can't know a thing in itself, because if you think about it, when we want to describe something, especially things like time, space, reality, who are we to describe that? Because we can only rely on our senses. So we're limited by that. So our senses pretty much dictate the reality of something. So does that thing rely on our senses for it to exist? Probably not. But our observation of it obviously can only be dictated by what we see, what we feel, what we hear. And that the idea of that is that it's limiting. It's difficult to explain. Well, try reading a whole novel of, thinking about this stuff. It is mind-blowing. And again, it's brilliant. Number 8 is Shadow of the Torture by Gene Wolfe. Shadow of the Torture is book 1 in Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. I only reread Shadow of the Torture this year. I did not reread the whole Book of the New Sun. You will see, though, that I did rank Shadow of the Torture kind of representing Book of the New Sun on my top 210 science fiction books video. And you know, if you saw that I ranked this really high, so I do love this. 8 is probably a low ranking for this, but again, I'm just basing this on the first book. It does need the full series for this to be the amazing feat of work that it is. Shadow of the Torture is still a great read. Severian, this starts out, he is a torturer in the Torturers Guild, but he takes pity on one of his clients. They call them clients, the people they're about to torture, and he allows this client to kill herself rather than her having to go through the torture. The repercussions of that decision lays the foundation for his journey, this incredible story, and the last thing I'll say about this is things are not what they seem to be. Number 7 is a 2022 release, so the first one so far on this list today. Number 7 is Goliath by Tochi Onyebuchi. I think this one came out with sort of mixed reviews, and I think because it sort of has a bit of a heavy political theme, so that could be the cause for why some people had mixed reactions to this. I thought this was brilliant. The world building is phenomenal. I love when I read a science fiction book where it's like almost nothing else I've read before. And that does always make for a great book, but it is a characteristic I like in a book. And it's not that often where I read a new release and I have that feeling of like, wow, I'm really reading something that's outside of what I generally will read in science fiction. This was a brilliant book by Onyebuchi. Tochi Onyebuchi presents a future world with systems and standards not too different than our current present world. That it's presented as a dystopia begs the question then if the world we live in now is a dystopia, or if it is for some and not for others. There are interesting themes in this about community and found family, survival. A big one is gentrification. There are elements where we're looking at the history of the Attica prison riots. Where the novel is sci-fi is there are colonies outside of the Earth where those who have means flee the now toxic Earth. The air, the soil, the water are all toxic. Those who stay behind, those who don't have the means to go to these colonies, you might imagine are folks of color. They stay behind and they have to be in domes. If you're not in the domes, you're pretty much going to be a goner pretty quickly. Even in the domes on this toxic Earth, your lifespan is not going to be that long, and that's why we have a lot of characters who are very young. There are a few old characters, but most of the characters are very young. I mentioned gentrification as the main theme in the story. It is one of the big themes in the story. It's one of the big injustices of the story. Now that the Earth is becoming more livable again, especially this area of New Haven, Connecticut, we now have folks coming from these colonies back to the Earth, now that those who have stayed behind have sort of fixed things up, and now here come the white people coming back in. It's a really interesting and thought-provoking read. Number 6 is The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. This is a first-time read for me this year. Last year, I reread Alfred Bester's The Stars My Destination, and I've had The Demolished Man on my to-be-read list for a long time, so I'm so glad I got to it. I was not let down. This is a whodunit, but we know who did it because we find out right away, and it's the main character, Reich. He plans a murder, but what's interesting is, how's he going to get away with this murder? Because there's all these espers around. In this world, we have espers. These are people who can read minds, who can read your thoughts. And not only that, the head detective who is on this case, Powell, he is a level 1 esper. That's like the top dog of espers. He's like the head of the Esper Guild even. He's that good. So Reich knows this, and so he has to plan this murder, keeping that in mind. And that's what makes this interesting, is the lengths to which Reich goes to try to thwart the espers, mostly Powell, and there's a bit of a cat and mouse thing going on. What's also really interesting is it's very inventive how Bester writes the parts where the espers are being espery, the mind-reading stuff. It's really inventive, and it's really interesting how it's presented in the book. Shouldn't Ender's Game be ranked higher than number 5? What's up with that? On my top 210 science fiction books video just a couple of months ago, it was in my top 5. This is one of my favorite reading experiences of all time. Well, it still is. I'm just talking about 2022. I reread this year. I still love it. Nothing's going to top reading it for the first time. And because I've read it and experienced it, I've loved it again. I just didn't love it for the first time. and there are 4 more books to go, and you'll have to just see what those are. In Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, kid geniuses are basically our last hope because we're fighting this alien race, the buggers. They've taken everything that we could throw at them, and the interesting thing is they learn from every attack and they adapt, so they have this uncanny ability to do that. So what's left? We take these genius kids and we monitor them and we breed the best and the brightest, and among them is Ender Wiggin. He might just be the one. So we send him to battle school. He's tested in these skirmishes of a sort. They're in 0G. These kids are playing like this laser tag type game. It's really interesting. We get to see his leadership skills. Ender's a kid who's been pretty bullied most of his life, especially because he's a third. He's the third child of a family, and most families don't have 3 kids. But could he be the one? Could he be the one that, finds out the path to how we defeat these buggers? There is no character in science fiction, for me, more empathetic than Ender Wiggin. We feel for him, we root for him, and we just hope that he is the one that will save humanity. Number 4 is Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. We've got hero protagonist, yours truly. These are the main protagonists of the story. The book is crazy, it's cool, it's quirky, it's fun. It's more cool than it is quirky, and hero protagonist is a hacker. He is sometimes working for the CIA. He's a pizza delivery guy for the mafia, and he's the #1 swordsman in the virtual reality world, the metaverse. The metaverse, this is, Stevenson being prescient about what virtual reality might be in the future. Just think this book was written back in the 90s, so again, very prescient. There is an ancient scroll. We get into themes of language and the power of language. But more than anything, it's the atmosphere, it's the world building, and it's the quirky and cool nature of this book. I absolutely recommend that you read this. It's unlike anything else that you've read in science fiction. Number 3 is Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I reread Children of Time this year, and I also listened to it again on audiobook because I wanted to include it in my audiobooks recommendations video, and it turned out to be a really good choice for an audiobook. I wasn't sure if it would be or not, but the narration work is just amazing. Check that out if you like audiobooks. Humans leaving a dying or dead Earth for greener pastures. How habitable the worlds that they find might hinge on the work of egotistical and brilliant scientist Avrana Kern. There's 2 storylines. One is Dr. Kern's work with her new uplift virus and plans to seed terraformed worlds with primates. The idea is that these primates will evolve uber fast because of the virus. Let's see how that turns out. The second timeline follows the crew of the Ark ship Gilgamesh. Between the 2 storylines are themes of interstellar travel, AI, eco-terrorism, mutiny and rebellion, and riveting interpersonal relationships. The storylines do eventually merge. If you haven't read this, read it. The sequel is really good as well, and there's a 3rd book coming out next year. So I think this is the first time that I filmed a video without any introduction, no explanation. After you check to make sure that you've subscribed to the channel, take a moment to leave a comment. Let me know if you like this format or if you miss having some setup at the beginning. Number 2 on my list is Spin by Robert Charles Wilson. The Earth is enshielded and the stars and the rest of the universe are blacked out. Time on the Earth and inside the force field moves at a rate of 1 year for every 100 million years in the universe outside of the force field. Imagine the implications of that. That's exactly what Wilson does. He imagines it and he creates an amazing and Hugo Award-winning story all around it. My number 1 read of 2022 is Empire Star by Samuel R. Delany. Those of you who watch this channel regularly know that I am a huge fan of Samuel R. Delany. Empire Star is fantastic. Empire Star is the adventure of Comet Joe. Joe receives a message that he must deliver to Empire Star. When we, the readers, meet Joe, he is a simplex-minded being. In some ways, simplex is a way of saying simple-minded. In his endeavor to deliver his message, he's sort of tutored along the way to think in a multiplex way by an interesting supporting cast. There's Lump, a multiplex linguistic intelligence that's by his side for much of the journey. There's Nit Tai Lee, a poet who only visits briefly, and Sanseverina, who's integral to Joe's development and appears to him in different forms or versions of her life. There is time travel in this, and it's wildly interesting, but that's really best left to be part of your eventual reading experience. There's also the Ol. The Ol are beings of great power who, if you're around them, they evoke from you a powerful and painful sadness. The metaphors present in this novella reached me connected with me in a way that few books ever had. I would expect some readers to have that same experience with this book, and others probably won't. After I read this book, I read it again this year, so I read this one twice as well, and upon reread, I have decided this is my favorite Samuel R. Delany book. Thank you for watching. I'm Michael Leverts, and this is Fit to be Read.